11 p.m. on a Tuesday night. A cold rain was just starting to smear the windshield of my rental car as I pulled onto my street. And that's when I saw it, a sleek, silver Mercedes SUV sitting right in my driveway, parked like it owned the place, while every single light in my house was blazing as if there was a Hollywood premiere going on in my living room. I just dragged myself off an 11-hour flight from Tokyo, cutting my business trip short by 10 days because the contract closed early and all I wanted in this world was to faceplant in my own pillow and sleep for 48 hours. But looking at my house, the inherited Victorian manor that had been in my family for 3 generations, I knew something was dead wrong. The front door was unlocked, which made my stomach do a slow, nauseating flip, and the moment I stepped into the foyer, the air didn't smell like my home. It smelled like expensive, suffocating lilies and Chanel No. 5, a scent that immediately triggered a migraine because it was the signature calling card of Julianne Sterling, the president of the Blackwood Heights Homeowners Association. I stood there in the dark hallway, my luggage still clutched in my hand, and I could hear the distinct sound of water running upstairs, specifically the high-pressure shower head in my master suite that I just spent $3,000 installing before I left, and someone was actually humming a Broadway tune while they washed away the day in my private sanctuary. I'm Leo, by the way, a 45-year-old software architect who spent the last year trying to rebuild a life that felt like it had been shredded in a wood chipper after a brutal divorce, and inheriting my great-aunt Martha's estate was supposed to be my fresh start, my quiet corner of the world where I could finally breathe again. This house was a sprawling, 5-bedroom beauty with wraparound porches and stained glass windows, a place that felt like a hug from the past. But in Blackwood Heights, beauty comes with a price, and that price usually has a clipboard and a very sharp set of teeth. Julianne Sterling was the kind of woman who treated the HOA bylaws like they were the 10 Commandments, and she was the only one who'd talk to God on the mountain. A real estate mogul who walked with the stiff-backed arrogance of a queen and had a memory for violations that would put a supercomputer to shame. From the day I moved in, she'd been on my back like a backpack. First, it was a $200 fine because my grass was a 1/4 inch too long during a heat wave. Then it was a formal citation because I dared to paint my front door a, in quote, non-approved, in quote, shade of slate gray that was apparently an affront to the neighborhood's, in quote, historical integrity, in quote. She lived in a much smaller, cramped townhouse on the edge of the development, and you didn't need a psychology degree to see that she looked at my inherited mansion with the kind of green-eyed envy that usually ends in a Greek tragedy. The last conversation we'd had before I left for Japan was on my driveway, where she'd stood with her arms crossed, eyeing my suitcases and telling me, and quote, "You know, Leo, a house this large and historic shoot into oppos. To be left unattended, things happen, pipes burst, vagrants notice, it's a liability for the whole community," end quote. And I just smiled and told her I had it under control, never imagining that her definition of, in quote, control, in quote, involved a loofah and my master bathroom. I didn't in oppos. TL, I didn't in oppos. T call 911 right away, because 10 years in high-stakes software negotiation teaches you to document the disaster before you try to fix it. So I pulled out my phone, set it to record, and started walking through my own house like a ghost. The kitchen was a wreck. There were empty wine bottles from my private cellar, high-end Napa cabs that I'd been saving for a special occasion, sitting on the counter next to a half-eaten charcuterie board and my grandmother in oppos, as China was sitting in the sink with dried cheese crusting on the edges. I felt this heat rising up the back of my neck, a slow-burn anger that was sharpening into something dangerous, and I headed upstairs, the floorboards creaking under my boots as I reached the landing just as the shower stopped. I stood there in the hallway, watching the steam curl out from under the door, and then the handle turned, and out walked Julianne, wrapped in one of my oversized Egyptian cotton towels, her hair up in a silk wrap, looking as relaxed as if she'd just spent a day at the Waldorf Astoria. When she saw me, she didn't scream, she didn't in oppos, to even flinch, she just stopped, narrowed her eyes, and said in that patronizing, honey-coated voice, and quote, "Oh, Leo, you're back early. What a surprise. You really should have called. I was just finishing up a security sweep of the premises," end quote. I looked at her, then at the steam behind her, then at the glass of my $300 Cabernet sitting on the vanity, and I just shook my head, my voice coming out low and steady, end quote. "Security sweep, Julianne? Is that what we're calling trespassing and grand theft wine these days? Because last I checked, I didn't in Oppos. T give you a key, and I certainly didn't in Oppos. T invite you to live in my master's suite. End quote. She pulled the towel tighter, her face flushing that ugly shade of blotchy red that only happened when she was being challenged, and she stepped toward me, tried to use her height to intimidate me even though she was soaking wet. End quote. Don and Oppos. TB dramatic Leo, as the HOA president I have emergency access rights to any property deemed in Oppos, temporarily abandoned in Oppos. Under the 2024 Safety Initiative, there was a reported prowler 3 nights ago, and as a courtesy to the estate, I've been maintaining a physical presence here to deter criminal activity. It's all in the bylaws if you'd bother to read the updates. End quote. I laughed, a sharp, cold sound that echoed off the high ceilings. And I told her, end quote, I wrote the code for systems that protect national banks, Julianne, I know what a bypass looks like, and I know for a fact the HOA doesn't in Oppos. T have the right to sleep in my bed too in Oppos. Deter prowlers into Oppos. So you have 5 minutes to get your things and get out of my house before I decide whether I end Oppos. Am calling the police or the local news first. End quote. That's when the door to the guest room down the hall opened and out stepped a guy I recognized immediately. Officer Miller, a local beat cop who'd been on the force for 20 years and was a regular at the Blackwood Heights board meetings, except he wasn't in Oppos. T in uniform, he was in a t-shirt and jeans, looking way too comfortable for someone standing in a stranger in Oppos. S house at midnight. End quote. Is there a problem here, Julianne? End quote. He asked, his hand instinctively going his hip where his holster would usually be, and the sight of him made the puzzle pieces in my head click together with a sickening thud. This wasn't an Oppos. T just a crazy lady with a power trip. This was a coordinated takeover. Julianne smirked, her confidence flooding back the moment she had, end quote. Back up, end quote. And she looked at me with this chilling, vacant smile, saying, end quote, Officer Miller is here as an official observer. Leo, we found evidence of end Oppos, irregularities in Oppos, in your property maintenance records while you were gone, and under the emergency conservatorship clause. We've taken temporary stewardship of the home to prevent it from falling into probate or becoming a community eyesore. End quote. I realized. Then that they weren't into Oppos. T just squatting. They were testing the waters to see if they could actually steal the house out from under me, probably using some obscure, fine-print loophole they'd buried in a 1,000-page HOA manifesto that nobody ever reads. I didn't in Oppos. T argued further. I just kept the camera rolling, catching the way Miller's eyes shifted when I pointed the lens at him, and I told them, end quote, fine, stay for the night if you want to play this game, but tomorrow, the world changes for both of you, end quote. And I walked out my own front door, went to a hotel, and spent the next 6 hours on my laptop. Most people think of an HOA as a group of neighbors arguing about the color of mulch, but in the hands of a professional manipulator like Julianne, it was a weaponized legal entity, and she'd been using it to systematically bully elderly residents into, end quote, selling, end quote, their homes to her real estate firm at a fraction of their value. I spent the night digging into the Blackwood Heights digital portal. Since I'm the guy who builds these types of secure infrastructures, I know exactly where the, end quote, backdoors, end quote, are, and I found a treasure trove of deleted emails and hidden folders that Julianne thought were gone forever. She'd been running a, end quote, showcase program, end quote, where she would identify residents who were traveling or in the hospital, use the HOAs, end quote, emergency access, end quote, keys to enter their homes, and then show those homes to prospective high-end buyers as, end quote, upcoming pocket listings, end quote, before the owners even knew they were being targeted. My house, with its Victorian charm and massive acreage, was her crown jewel. She'd already drafted a, end quote, notice of foreclosure, end quote, based on faked unpaid fines and, end quote, structural neglect, end quote, charges that totaled over $50,000, a document she was planning to file the very week I was supposed to be in Japan. The next morning, I didn't in Oppos. T go back with a hammer. I went back with a team, my lawyer, a forensic accountant I'd worked with on corporate fraud cases, and an investigative journalist from the city's biggest paper who owed me a favor for fixing his daughter in Oppos' encrypted drive last year. We met at the community center, where Julianne was holding a, end quote, special emergency session, end quote, to discuss, end quote, member misconduct, end quote, which was clearly a euphemism for, end quote, how we in Oppos, we're going to kick Leo out of his house permanently, end quote. She was sitting at the head of the table, looking like the picture of suburban grace in a pearl necklace, until I walked in and dropped the 200-page binder on the table in front of her, end quote. I think you missed a few items in your security sweep, Julianne, end quote, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room as the other board members, mostly terrified retirees who'd been under her thumb for years, looked on in shock. I pulled up the projector, bypassed her password-protected system in about 10 seconds, and started showing the room exactly what I'd found. The photos of her hosting a cocktail party for real estate investors in my dining room while I was in Tokyo, the audio recordings from my home's built-in smart hub of her discussing which of my furniture pieces she wanted to keep, and the digital trail of the $47,000 she'd embezzled from the HOA's, end quote, maintenance reserve, end quote, to pay for her own personal legal fees and luxury car leases. The room turned into a powder keg. People started standing up, shouting out their own stories of being fined into poverty or threatened with liens for things they didn't into Oppos. Do, and Julianne's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white as she realized the, end quote, ignorant newcomer, end quote, was actually the guy who could deconstruct her entire life with a few keystrokes. But the real kicker, the thing that actually broke her, was when I played the video of her and Officer Miller in my kitchen talking about how they were going to, end quote, liquidate the assets, end quote. Once the foreclosure went through and Miller realized his career was in Oppos, just over, it was headed for a prison cell. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Not Miller's buddies, but the state troopers I'd called that morning after presenting my evidence to the district attorney. And watching Julianne Sterling get led out of the community center in handcuffs while still trying to scream about, end quote, bylaw violations, end quote, was the most cinematic moment of my entire life. It took 6 months to clean up the mess. Julianne took a plea deal for 9 years on charges of racketeering, grand larceny, and conspiracy, while Miller is currently serving 5 years for official misconduct and residential burglary. The HOA was completely disbanded and reformed with a new board, one that I'm now the president of, ironically enough, and we've spent the last few months returning every single fraudulent fine and helping the families Julianne cheated get their properties back. My house feels different now. It doesn't just feel like an inheritance, it feels like a fortress I fought for. A place where the history ISN and Oppos, just in the walls, but in the victory of standing up to a bully who thought she could hide behind a clipboard and a title. People still ask me why I didn't end Oppos. Just sell and leave after that first night, and I tell them that sometimes you don't in Oppos. Inherit a house just to live in it. You inherit it to protect the community that surrounds it. But honestly, the best part of the whole thing ISN and Oppos, the legal victory, or the, end quote, Marcus law, end quote, they're passing at the state level to regulate HOAs. It's the fact that every time I walk into my kitchen, I remember that I'm the one who's home, and Julianne is currently living in a space that's about 6 by 8 feet with very strictly enforced, end quote, community standards, end quote. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, and I want to know what you guys think. During the discovery phase of the trial, we found out that Julianne had an Oppos. Just been doing this for the money. She had a list of over 30 other, end quote, targets, end quote, in neighboring HOAs, and she was part of a larger network of real estate agents and local officials who were doing this across the entire state. We stopped her, sure, but how many people are out there right now, coming home from a trip only to find their locks changed and their lives being sold off by the very people who are supposed to protect their property values? Is an HOA ever really about the community, or is it just a playground for small-minded tyrants to practice for the big leagues? Drop a comment below and tell me if you've ever had a run-in with Karen, end quote, who thought she was the law, or if you think I went too far by nuking her entire career. I want to hear the truth because in my experience, the only thing more dangerous than a criminal with a gun is a neighbor with a grievance and a legal loophole. Don and Oppos. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear more about how we're taking down the rest of Julianne's network. Because trust me, this story is far from over.